Joshua gives the Israelites before they cross the Jordan into the promised land. They say, you now have a choice, like make up your mind. Do you want to follow the Eloheem of Egypt? Do you want to follow the Eloheem of Mesopotamia? Or do you want to follow Yahweh as the monotheistic concept of one God that rules, controls, designs, etc., everything?
You know, the prophet Daniel in the Old Testament, I think it's 4:23 in Daniel, says that he was given a vision by God where he saw the earth and it was in a total, the words were a desolation, a destruction and a desolation of the world, in a vision taking him back to an ancient time. That reminded me of Genesis 1:2, where it says that God created the heavens of the earth, or Elohim created the heavens of the earth.
You raise a very, very fundamental question for biblical scholars, and that's for theologians. In Hebrew, the sentence, the verse says, Bereshit, which is translated in the beginning. Elohim, God, created the heaven and the earth. And many, many theologians for generations, even goes back to Talmudic times, even the time of the temple, the second temple, asked how could it be that the story of creation, of beginning, starts with the second letter of the alphabet, the bet, the beta, the B, and not with the first letter of the alphabet, the aleph, the alpha. It just beats logic, beats your beliefs. And what I show in my book, the latest one, Divine Encounters, is that if you add the aleph, which may have dropped somewhere along the writings, etc., of the Bible, it becomes that not Bereshit, Av Reshit, the father of beginning, created Elohim, the heaven and the earth.
Okay.
So the supreme creator created the Anunnaki, Elohim, the heaven and the earth.
And that is a whole different subject.
That I really hope that through this interview and all the exposure that it will thus give, that those who have the say in these matters would really consider this suggestion by me, that if you add the aleph, you give a whole new dimension to this first sentence of the first book of the Bible.
Very, very interesting. Very important, I feel.
So, when I heard that, because I wasn't aware that Sitchin believed that. And it actually gave me a little bit more respect for that man, because, I have thought that he may have made some mistakes in his interpretation of the Sumerian tablets, and I wasn't completely too aware of his interpretation of the Bible itself. But I assumed that, he would have interpreted the Bible a lot more, quite differently than if he had not studied the Sumerian tablets. But not only that he came to the interpretation when he translated the Sumerian tablets, that there were these Anunnaki that came to Earth, and that they had this other planet before, and this was Nibiru. Well, then you begin to see, after what you just heard, that basically, and you'll see this as we go, and it has a lot to do with the sun disk that Jehovah's Witnesses put on their literature, and that was in the Akkadian languages and the Egyptian and the Babylonian. They had all these symbols of this winged sun disk, which Sitchin says, as you'll see here in a bit, was the deity that was above the sun itself. Shamak was the sun, but the sun, Samek, was literally in the Akkadian, Babylonian, Sumerian tablets. He was the son of someone. He was not the highest. He was the son of the moon deity. I think that's pretty interesting because what Sitchin is saying that the Sumerian Akkadian tablets teach is that the moon is greater than the sun, I guess, because he's the father of the sun, which I think is something we need to explore a little bit. But beyond that, beyond the sun and the moon, there is a higher deity, and they represented it as the winged sun disk. But it's not the sun; it's a different star or orb that ruled the rest. Now, I'll get to what Joseph Smith said about this here in a bit, and my own understanding is that it has to do with the revolutions. So supposedly we revolve around the sun, or the sun revolves around us, whatever. But beyond the sun and the revolutions of the sun and the moon, we have what appears to the ancient ones is Polaris, which everything seems to revolve around. Now, modern scientists say it's because we're just orbiting, or we're not orbiting, but we're spinning on our axis. And so at the North Pole, whatever star happens to be there looks as if we're revolving and it's in the center. Well, whatever the case, whether it's an appearance or whether it's reality, because we certainly don't know if science today is correct that we're revolving around the sun, or the sun's revolving around us, or that we're, in this particular solar system and its positions as they have told us, that perhaps the sun may not be 93 million miles away. Perhaps the moon isn't 240,000 miles away. And a little bit off subject, but for me, I have a feeling that perhaps the moon is not that far away because of the fact that I can see definition from the Earth. If it's 240,000 miles, how could I see the definitions, the craters, what appears to be sunken, dark, shadowy, almost like continents on the moon, when I cannot see definition on a mountain 20 miles away? So, but Sitchin says that all of these tablets have these hieroglyphic writings that demonstrate the deities in terms of the planets, the sun, the moon, which are planets, and that what rules them is this winged sun disk, which Sitchin interprets as Nibiru, which I don't know that I agree with. What I think the sun disk is Cepheus, which used to be the pole star. 2,000 years later, now we've got Polaris, which in the Chinese is the emperor's seat, and the old Egyptian understanding was the phoenix, which, by the way, is the bird with the outstretched wings, or perhaps the winged sun disk, which, as you'll see, even Sitchin says that this winged sun disk that reigns over the other planets because of the revolutions, because we revolve around Polaris, which is the winged sun disk or phoenix, is also, it has to do, we'll see here in a minute, with the word apex or Cepheus. It has to do with the word apex, or what you would say is the pinnacle. And the pinnacle of the temple is where Jesus was taken to. Now, there is no pinnacle on the Herodian temple in Jerusalem, or Solomon's temple, but there is a pinnacle on the Great Pyramid, which is where Jesus was taken to at Heliopolis, and we have proven that in other prior videos. But the whole point of the apex, the chief cornerstone, which is the top cornerstone, not the foundational cornerstone. And we'll see more about that here in a minute. And Sitchin talks about this. But the apex is the chief, and therefore is the ruler of all the rest. And there are 72 stones in the Great Pyramid below that are subject to the apex. And then all of the casing stones around the Great Pyramid originally were 144,000. But the pyramid was literally like a cone. It had a peak. And so, like the universe, these planets go from one to another like planes until you reach the pinnacle, which is Polaris, which at one time was Cepheus for the Greeks. And Cepheus is the great father. Cassiopeia was the mother. These were African patriarchs, or the deities. But as we continue here, you'll begin to understand the importance of all of this. It's the understanding that one should get when reading the Bible. And all of these deities are rulers. Now, the sun rules the day and the moon rules the night. Well, these are the rulers. And the greatest ruler is the great sun disk, which is not the sun, but which is Polaris, and which is why all of the Akkadian, Babylonian, Sumerian biblical information is reverencing the Great Pyramid, as it does in Isaiah 19, I think 19, where it is a monument unto the Lord. And it is a monument because it represents the government. And in the hieroglyphs, it speaks of all of these things and has these symbols that Sitchin will tell you about, with each of the planets, one having 6 rays, one having 5 rays, or one having 7 rays, representing in order the planets from Polaris all the way down to the sun and the planets and the moon. Well, it's quite interesting, and we'll go into this further here in a minute. So, in other nations, they had different words or names for these deities, but which are etymologically related. They have the same sounds when you sound them out, but the other languages may use different characters because they had a different pronunciation, but it's the same words. As we'll find, this word Cepheus is related to the Greek Cephas, which Jesus called Peter. But that wasn't his name. His name was, well, it wasn't Peter either, was it? It was Simon, son of Jonas. And he said, I'm going to call you Peter. But then he says, Cephas. Well, what does that have to do with him? He's got all these different names. They're not his names. What Jesus was doing is, says, you're the chief. You're going to be the head. You're at the pinnacle. You're at the top. Everything revolves around you. You'll be the Petros, father, which is what Cepheus is in the Greek pantheon, is the father. So in my mind, there's no doubt about this. But of course, these characters have different names or pronounced differently in our Bible. We have in our Bible Enoch. Not Phoenix, but Enoch. Not the Sumerian Enki, but Enoch. And of course, Enoch and Adam were before the flood, and these are the what we call the patriarchs, but what the Egyptians, the Babylonians, Sumerians call the gods, or the Eloheem. But ruling over all is the one in the center, what everything revolves around, which today it revolves around Polaris, which is coming to its zenith in 2100. But it has been going towards its zenith and is very close at this point to becoming the pole star. It will sit upon the throne, the Messiah, the son of deity, and he will reign. But previous to that, everything revolved around Cephas in the Greek, Cassiopeia. And this was the mother and the father. Of according to the Greeks. But the Father, then, is the star that originally everything revolved around, which is the star Cephus. And the Bible does say that Christ will reign until all enemies are defeated. Death will finally be defeated. And then he will hand everything back unto his deity and his Father. So again, once again, we'll get to a place where everything will revolve around Cephas and no longer Polaris. So certainly the rulership of the world is originally someone, and then it is granted the son or the heir reigns, and then the heir is only reigning to bring everything back into subjection to the Father. So this fits with Polaris, and I don't know that Sitch had understood this. However, something that Sitchin does know, because he is a Jew and is familiar in his studies with the ancient Talmudic Jews and other ancient rabbis, particularly in the Sephardic area, where we get Kabbalah and all of these esoteric teachings. But Joseph Smith said that an old rabbi told him, and as we pointed out here, that rabbi probably was Abraham Jonas, who was a Mason and initiated Joseph Smith. And Abraham Jonas was the Grand Master of Illinois and Kentucky. Now that's a pretty high position in America at that time, because it was always these individuals that were the Grand Masters, the original Grand Masters, that were the chief individuals in the authority, because all of those in authority in America at that time were Masons, although a few like John Adams refused to become a Mason because he had his reservations about bringing this hierarchy of the Masonic lineages from Mary Magdalene, which he believed probably was very prophetic and very essential to getting them to this point. But at this point, he believed in starting a government for the people and by the people that would sever all ties in this authority with this other institution that had been going along, which was the Knights of St. John handing down the authority, and the knights being priests, was something that was important in bringing it to this point. But now they were going to give the world a document which would be more important than any other document hitherto given to men, other than the Sermon on the Mount, which Jesus gave, because everyone traces their authority back to Jesus, including the Masons. But other than the Torah, which Moses gave on Mount Sinai, the greatest document would be the Constitution, which changed the world and gave the entire world, changed their beliefs. And like Moses brought everyone under law, Jesus gave everyone grace, but the Constitution would then ratify our rights under that grace and that liberty for all men and justice. And the interesting thing about the man who made that, everybody thinks, is Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Constitution. But Thomas Jefferson was working for Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, John Adams. And these two men were the ones who told Thomas Jefferson to write it, and they told him what to write. Thomas Jefferson was more like a scribe for Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. And it's difficult to know exactly who was higher, although I think John Adams was giving a position of reverence, just almost like the fact that they just honored him because of his integrity. But in fact, Benjamin Franklin was the Grand Master of that time. And therefore, you see the importance of a Grand Master. Now, the Virginia district of Masons, they wanted Washington to be the Grand Master, but he refused that position. He turned it down, but they wanted him to be, which tells you how they felt about George Washington. He refused it because of his military commitments. He didn't feel he was worthy of leading this body of peacekeepers and teachers of love and liberty, because he had to do the business of defending the country. And he didn't feel that that was appropriate because he has so much integrity. But this gives you a little idea. If you go back and look at the Grandmasters, these were the ones that were running the country until they established the Constitution, and then it transferred over to the President of the United States. So I say that because the Grandmaster of Illinois and Kentucky, which would then be kind of the lineage of this Grandmasterism, right? It may have started in Boston and Virginia, but as it went west, it went to Kentucky, and there were a great deal of people that stemmed from that region as time went on, and then they were going and moving west to Illinois, which is where Joseph Smith went and was commissioned by the Grand Master Abraham Jonas to build up the Kingdom of Zion and go west to far west Missouri, which at that time was the Rocky Mountains because it was a territory. So this tells you just how important Abraham Jonas was in those times and how he felt that authority would then be handed on to Joseph Smith. But of course, the other group that formed the Knights of the Golden Circle that assassinated Lincoln, they appear to be the ones who were fighting against this liberality and this abolitionism and total freedom and equality of men. But this Abraham Jonas must have been a highly respected individual at that time. And he was evidently Joseph Smith's teacher, that Joseph Smith talked about as some wise rabbis or an old rabbi that he spoke of that told him. And Joseph Smith said, not only because the rabbi told him, but because he had divine revelation, that the translation of Genesis 1:1 was incorrect. And I will read you here what Joseph Smith said about it. And what I find very interesting is that this is what Sitchin is saying. And Sitchin himself says, as you just saw, that the old rabbis, all the way back to ancient times, believed this. But this is what Joseph Smith said. AI says, yes, Joseph Smith originally stated that the head one of the gods brought forth the gods. Where did he get this? Well, I remember reading about this, and Joseph Smith would say that in the word, in the beginning, Eloheem, we have it translated that way. But the word beginning really is the Rosh. Part of the word is Rosh, and it means the chief. And so Joseph Smith was saying that it really is saying the head one of the deities, or the chief, or the beginning of the deities, created the Eloheem, and they created the heavens and the earth. And so, a lot of people will say, well, Joseph Smith was crazy. I mean, he's reinterpreting the Bible, and he's got his own translation, and he believes that Elohim created the world. And he also believed that Elohim was plural, which a lot of scholars today will say, no, that's not true. Plural of majesty, it's not plural. Even though it's used in a plural sense all the way through, even right there in Genesis chapter 1, where it says, let us make man in our image. So it certainly is in the plural. But here is where we have confirmation for what Joseph Smith was saying. And so it's in the beginning was modified by Joseph Smith to reflect a council of deities where the head one initiated the creation. Joseph Smith's translation, also known as the Joseph Smith translation, included significant changes and interpretations, particularly of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Smith's interpretation emphasized a hierarchical structure of deities, with a head one leading the creation process. The council of the deities. The original text, according to Joseph Smith, indicated that the head one of the deities convened a council to plan the creation of the world, as explained by the Dialogue Journal. So, bara and the creation. Smith also discussed the Hebrew word bara, often translated as created, and its meaning in the context of Genesis 1:1. He argued that bara means to shape, fashion, organize, and form, rather than to create something from nothing. So interesting. But I want to go back and listen to a little bit more of what Sitchin is saying.
The second scripture, where it says, and in that time God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. I am told, and as I have researched this, that it can be equally and legitimately translated a different way. Rather than the earth was without form and void, it can be translated the earth was a waste and a desolation, or became a waste and a desolation, implying that there was already an earth situated, then came a great destruction, and then the earth became a waste and a void. So that the implications, from what I can gather, is that Genesis 1:1 is saying what you have established, and then Genesis 1:2 is saying that the earth that we have today is a recreation or a new situation, because it was an earth in former times that was destroyed.
Well, there are these interpretations of how to understand that verse, but of course there is a Sitchin interpretation,
Right.
because it is clear, not just to me, to all scholars, that the story of creation and then continuation, the Tower of Babel, the Garden of Eden, and of course the Deluge, the Great Flood, are really versions, concise versions based on the earlier Sumerian writings. People have to remember that Abraham was a Sumerian, and therefore if these are versions of the Sumerian epic of creation and Nomalish, then the words Tehom Rabbah, which are translated as chaos and all the other terms that you have mentioned, really refer to Tiamat, Rabbah, Tiamat the great Tiamat, and therefore it is precisely what the Sumerian texts say, that there was another planet that perished in the celestial battle and the collision, and therefore the interpretation that you mentioned, though it is not linked to the words or to the name Tiamat.
Well, I have to break in here because I have learned something over the years that I think fits with this that Sitchin is saying. And I wish I could have actually sat down with Sitchin, because, you know, in the beginning I thought Sitchin was very right, and I was reading and learning about some of the things he was talking about in this Nibiru thing. Since then, I've realized that he's not right about Nibiru. And it's odd because, you know, I mean, how could he have gotten it all right? But yet now I'm seeing that he really did understand all of this the best he could have at that time. And our knowledge continues to increase because of what we have dug up since then. And now we've got AI. We can ask all these questions. We can get to the bottom of these things. Of course, I've been learning about this even before I really was working with AI. But he says here, he's right. He says it has to do with Tiamat, but he says it's not really in the scripture. Yeah, it actually is. Because Genesis 1:1 says, and there was Toa and Boa upon the surface of the deep. Well, Toa and Boa literally is Tiamat. It's time and matter before the swirling masses. So rather than a planet that crashed and created the universe, like Nibiru, what he's saying, and there could have been something that is relevant to that when you consider the asteroid belt and so forth. But that's another subject. What he's talking about is the time and matter way before, before the advancement and the creation, as we call it, or the evolution of the universe from its beginning, and which is not in time, right? Because here the Eloheem are before they're creating, right? They're before the Toa and the Boa, or the Tiamat. And so these are the two on the temples. You always find these two gargoyles that are guarding the entrance of the temple. And they're sometimes considered like seraphim. Now the seraphim in the Bible were two serpents. The Babylonian, Sumerian tablets, Akkadian talk about these two serpents. One of which was Ninsida and one of which was Damuzi. But these two serpents in our Bible is seraphim, meaning seraph or serpents. There's two of them, each had 6 wings. So the 6 wings apiece make the 12 houses around the throne. Everything revolves around, which, as we've said, is Polaris. Well, what is there guarding that throne of Cepheus and Polaris, or the North Pole, that everything revolves around? What is guarding it? Well, there is a great dragon that drags a third of the stars of heaven, literally Draco. And right around on the other side of Polaris is the bear. Elsewhere in our Bible, it is sometimes described or called Leviathan and Behemoth. Leviathan, this would be from the perspective of the Egyptian understanding, because Yahweh says, I have pierced the dragon that is in the sea, the great Leviathan. Well, the dragon is Tiamat. That's what the dragon is. And Behemoth, he is the hippopotamus. So Leviathan was the alligator or the crocodile, is what it would be. And Behemoth is also, they're both in the sea, right? Or the swampy areas is where the Behemoth is. He's splashing around and going down under the swampy waters, as well as the crocodile. They live in these swampy waters, which the Sumerian called the Absu, or the abyss, which was one of the deities, the Absu. And the one who eventually took up his throne and rules over the abyss became Yahweh, according to the Hebrews. Well, the Babylonians say it was Ea Enki's son, Marduk. But either way, and of course, Ea Enki was Yahweh. So it's all related. But Leviathan in the Bible, the great dragon, is Tiamat, and Behemoth is the counterpart, the hippopotamus, which today we call the bear, because we're looking at these signs from a more Nordic perspective. And when they looked up, they saw it as a bear rather than a hippo, but it is still a dragon on the other side, or we call Draco. Now, this bear is, we call it Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper. But the bear, the word Ursa goes back to this word that means bear, female bear. It is guarded by the star Arcturus, which is what we call the Arctic or the North, because that star is supposed to be guarding the bear. and protecting it. So it's all the Arctic, and then we've got Draco. Now, it's interesting in the stories of King Arthur, this may be where the word Arthur comes from. Arthur, the protector of the bear. Remember that King Arthur's father was Arthur Pendragon. Well, there is your dragon. And of course, the legends say that the Merovingian line goes back to this dragon from the sea. And what it's really talking about is the beginnings of time and the one who will be the protector of this Mary Magdalene, who is Ishtar and Nana riding the beast. It's all interrelated, but I don't want to go into it too deep here. However, we see how this is connected then to the Arctic Circle, right? Which is, the north. And you'll remember that at least 2 different times in our Bible, it says that the Lord dwelleth on Mount Zion, like the pinnacle of a mountain, like a pyramid, the apex, where everything revolves around. In the remotest regions of the north, the city of the Grand King, beautiful for situation. Where is this city? It is in the center, which is the spiritual before time and space, outside of time and space, the higher being within us all. So you have the star Arcturus, which is guarding the bear, and the bear itself, which is the Great Dipper, which everybody can look up in. Today we call it the Great Dipper. You look up in the sky and it's going around and around, and then the middle, you follow the Big Dipper's handle and you will come out to Polaris. So these 2 stars guard the way to the tree of life, which is in the center, which is before time. It's not about time and space. It's about going outside of the material realm into the higher consciousness, which anyone can do, whether you be at the beginning of time or at the end of time, which there is no such thing. It's an ongoing, it's the source that creates the material, but as long as there is a source, there will always be a material. It is symbolic that it is in the beginning, but it's reality, it's the beginning of the source. And so the source is the spiritual, the light, the greater light that rules and everything revolves around, which is Polaris. So these 2, Tiamat that he's speaking of, is not a planet that blew up. He didn't understand that. It is time and space which made the rest of the universe that was prior to the creation, which the Bible specifically gives in its Hebrew words there, toa and ba, or the empty and the void, right? The empty meaning the matter that hadn't yet arrived. It was empty. And the void, which is the time that hadn't yet come. So that is what Tiamat is, time and matter. But I think it's brilliant that Sitchin understood it to the extent that he did. But let's continue on with what he has to say.
Links to the same meaningful result, in other words, that Earth is the result of a celestial catastrophe. There was a catastrophe from which our planet emerged. Right.
Yeah.
So it leads to the same conclusion in different ways, and maybe it's good that two approaches lead to the same conclusion.
Yeah, but I have always felt that there was most likely another civilization, ancient civilizations, even before, and this is just my own conjecture, even before the ones that we know of.
Definitely, you're absolutely right on that, because even according to the Sumerian tales, and especially, many texts, but especially the so-called King List, that deals with the cities, pre-Antediluvian cities, and with the 10 preceding the deluge, 10 rulers, which some compare to the 10 patriarchs in the Bible before the deluge. And there were cities, there was a civilization. The Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, boasted that he could read tablets from before the flood. So all the indications are that they recognized, referred to, and accepted the fact that there was a civilization, but a civilization of the gods. Because those cities, pre-Diluvial, are spoken of as cities of the gods.
Right.
After the deluge, there came cities of men with the help of the Anunnaki. So there was a time of a, let's call it a divine civilization, divine culture. As you, I'm sure, know, in the Egyptian beliefs, the priest Manetho, who paralleled the Chaldean Berosus, they lived more or less at the same time, and the heirs of Alexander in what became eventually Byzantine hired a Babylonian priest to write the history of the world of mankind based on the Mesopotamian. And the Ptolemies in Egypt hired the priest, the Egyptian priest Manetho, to do the same. But the versions are very similar. Both, by the way, spoke of a series of calamities that preceded the deluge. It's not clear at what intervals.
Calamities that would have preceded the deluge.
Yeah. The deluge was just one of them, the most remembered one, right? According to Berosus, indeed, they were alternating. There were calamities by heat and fire, and then there were calamities by water and cold, etc. And Manetho also spoke about dynasties of the gods, which is the Sumerian gods, because I show in my books that they were one and the same, and that if you ask yourself what do the names mean, you see that the names meant the same, except this was in ancient Egyptian, this was in Sumerian, or later Babylonian, Akkadian. And then he said there was a period, according to Manetho, of almost 3,600 years of demigods, which meant offspring of the Anunnaki, like the sons of gods in the Bible says married the daughters of men and had children by them, and these would be called demigods.
Right.
And then only began the human civilization with the pharaohs around 3,100 BC. So what you are stating very succinctly is really can be supported and expanded by all these records from the past, some available more or less complete, many just in fragments.
I'm so very appreciative of your time, but I really have to ask you something that's important to me. In my particular work in examining the occult or hidden symbolism in our modern day religious and political movements, I became fascinated about 20 years ago with the symbol of the sun as it is used by the secret societies, the fraternal orders, and especially in our political and religious symbolism today. It was fascinating to me that the sun, when you brought up that what we're talking about, or it was, I guess David Talbot even talked about the sun being Saturn. But the sun has been used, that sun symbol with the winged sun, you brought out was a symbol of the Anunnaki.
And a symbol of Nibiru, of the so-called 12th planet.
All right, so that implies...
Because as I showed you on these monuments, which I shall just do them, I could choose many more. And that symbol, by the way, also appears on Egyptian monuments and Hittite monuments. Right, this was the symbol connecting the king, the priesthood with their gods, with the small g. That was the symbol of the planet.
So you'll see here that Sitchin is saying that all these planets in their graduating ascent, from 1 to 12. And what rules them all is this winged disk, which is not, a lot of people think it's the winged sun disk, but it's not the sun. And he'll explain that here in a minute. But he says it's Nibiru. Well, I don't think it's Nibiru. Nibiru, I believe, probably comes from the Sumerian and means Jupiter. And I don't think Jupiter is what it's speaking of. It's the winged disk that rules them all. And it is the Egyptian phoenix, which is, they claim, Polaris. And this is why it rules them all, because it's in the center. And so you'll remember that one of the big points, other than this big Nibiru idea from Sitchin, is that there was these 3,600 years, and every 3,600 years it would come back around. Well, I don't think he's got that quite right either. There may be a 3,600 year cycle, but it is not specifically that. It's really just talking about the 360 degrees of the circle, because it's about rotation, and it's about each of these circles making a wider circle, but ultimately they all go 360 degrees. And they're all of these cycles. So in Hindu, you have yugas. In the Greek, it was the ages. But the ugas, or the yugas, are made up of 360, always, and variations of that. These are the ages. So let's go back to what he's saying, because it gets very interesting here.
And as I showed on the same monument, which gives the 12 members of the solar system, you definitely see the sun, with its rays, totally separate, and the symbol of what's called the winged disk. And
Earth, okay. So you see them simultaneously together
on the same depictions, which are repeated, and you see Earth as the seventh planet. In many instances, you see Venus as the eighth planet with 8 rays. You see Mars as the sixth planet with 6 rays. So everything corroborates what I've written.
Well, the sun, as I said, is a particularly important symbol to me because I see it in so many political and religious depictions and symbols. And of course, with the coming of Christianity, the concept that the Messiah is God's son, and I believe that there can be a comparison made between the ancient veneration of the sun, S-U-N in our language, as opposed to a veneration of the individual, S-O-N. And I think probably that has some problems with our languages and interpretation. But what do you think about the symbol of the sun itself and the importance to the ancients, like the Sumerians, etc.?
Well, if you're talking about the winged disk, then this stood for the planet from which the Anunnaki came.
I want to break in here too, because I think this is a good point to make this point. So he's taking this all too literal. Belankowski did the same thing, talking about the worlds in collision and so forth. Very dramatic cycles and destruction and violence, but they're not talking about that. We're talking about the creation. And he's probably not understanding as well that the Eloheem is us. It is us in our premortal position, in our spiritual, immortal existence. We all came down from heaven to earth. We came to the earth, all of us, to get bodies. And the material is the other part of our existence. And this is the great wedding at the end of time. So where he's talking about the Anunnaki came from, this, he says it's a planet. He's misunderstanding that Nibiru, or as he understands it, at least, shall we say, more specifically, the winged sun disk, which is the phoenix bird with the 2 outstretched wings, is beyond the dragon of Tiamat, or time and matter. It is the center or the source of the material universe, beyond time and matter, a place where we go within. It is a spiritual place where our counterpart or the reality exists outside of time and matter. It's where we will eventually attain again and yet still maintain our physical. But we will gain access. There'll be a great wedding. Matter and spirit will be joined, inseparably joined together as one. And that will be the great orgasm. And it's something that's ongoing. As material beings, we need to seek that source, that wisdom, that spiritual knowing, that attainment, the atonement. And so we didn't come from a planet, Nibiru, but we came from the source, our immortal home with our Heavenly Father and Divine Mother, Cepheus and Cassiopeus, and the Divine Son, which is the heir to all of this, Jesus Christ, the firstborn among many brethren.
In Sumerian times, with the ensuing Babylonian and Assyrian, the sun god, Utu in Sumerian, Shamash in Hebrew and all the other languages, was not a significant deity at all in the hierarchy. The Shamash, according to the Sumerian, and therefore further on believed by the Assyrians, Babylonians, and others, was the son of the god that in Akkadian is called Sin, not from sinning, but it really was from Sumerian Suen. And he was the moon god. So according to these hierarchies, Shamash was the son of the moon god. Not so when it came to Nibiru. The ruler of the Nibiru stood at the head of the pantheon. So the pantheon had to do with the Anunnaki, from where they came, and the ruler there was the head, and his symbol was the winged disc. So this really has to do with all these misconceptions about who the ancient peoples really worship.
Whether that's what I'm trying to get
And many books written, especially at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of this century, say they were these or that people were sun worshippers, and this was a sun religion, and the Egyptian called Ra. I mean, the same people who spell it Re, R-E, then go and write the name of the pharaoh Ramses, which means issue, emanating from Ra. So when they say the name of the pharaoh, they say Ra, but when they say the name of the god, they spell it Re. So it's Ra, because it also appears in the Bible. So they say he was the sun god. He was not the sun god. He was the god who came from the planet of millions of years, which is the parallel of Nibiru. A planet, definitely a planet, not the sun. So there's so many misconceptions that it may take a century to get rid of, because it's an accumulation of 2-3 centuries of research.
In my collection, I have about 4 or 5, I think it's 5, 2 of them are doctoral theses, and others are articles, long extended articles appearing in the Middle East on the word chief cornerstone. And I picked up on that. That was a fascinating study where the word chief cornerstone is translated from the Hebrew when it appears in Hebrew, which is, I think, Psalms 118:22, where Messiah is referred to as the chief cornerstone. While in the Christian Greek scriptures of the New Testament, the Messiah or Jesus is referred to twice as the chief cornerstone. That word chief cornerstone, what does it actually imply for the Messiah in both Psalms and in the Greek? Have you?
It is not cornerstone. In other words, when you lay the foundation, you have a cornerstone.
Right.
It's the apex stone, Rosh Pinah, the head where the sides meet, like in a pyramid, the apex stone, the top stone, the one that is really the conduit to the heavens.
Yeah, because I That's what these articles were all saying. Everyone was saying it was the pinnacle of
Pinnacle.
the pinnacle.
Pinnacle,
Yes.
but not
But not the
foundation
cornerstone.
stone on the
Right.
ground.
Now, the big question, of course, obviously is going to be, on the back of the $1 bill, of course, is the Egyptian pyramid with the 72 stones of the 72 names of God, I believe. But the implication
With the
is that
apex
with the
floating
apex,
heavenward.
right?
Yeah.
And if that is
Which
in
is the,
fact,
the Masonic symbol.
that's right. But it is also, as you brought out, the word actually in Hebrew in Psalm
Rosh
18,
Pinah, yeah.
which means the peak of the pinnacle.
The pinnacle
And remember,
stone.
even in the New Testament, when Satan takes Jesus to the temple to tempt him, the scripture says he takes him up to the pinnacle of the temple, to the point of the temple. I am totally sure that there's a lot of symbolism that the early.
I think we should rewrite the Bible.
Yeah.
In English, not in Hebrew.
Oh boy, well, that's just amazing that even though Sitchin didn't fully understand this, he's maybe taking this a little too literally, and this has gone around the world now, and everybody's talking about all this Nibiru and this planet crashing and this all these kind of ideas that took off on their own. But it's a little bit of a distortion of the real truth, but we're going to get there. And hopefully with this video, many of you will begin to understand this and begin to take it to your channels and teach it. But we've got to understand that the source where all men in the universe came from is not a planet called Nibiru that travels around 3,600 years, but it's talking about the 360 degrees of the circle, and the pinnacle of that rotation that everything revolves around is Polaris. And that itself may very well just be a symbol, because ultimately what we're talking about is the center of our spiritual being, the immortal place within us all that we have to gain contact with. Now, I wanted to talk to you about a lot more things, and we're going to do a video tomorrow and hopefully get into this even deeper, if you can believe that. Because we're going to show you things about this apex that will show beyond any doubt that what we've been saying is true, and that this word Cepheus literally does have to do with the Father that reigns over the world. This is why Peter's name was Father or Petros, which comes from Petra, Father. It's just another, we say Father with an F because sometimes P's in the Phoenician is a PH or a F. It's just like Phoenix is Enoch. So all of this has to do with this apex, where Jesus was taken to the pinnacle of the temple, really represents within the universe unto the presence of the great Shekinah glory, where he understood his true divine being. And you see, when you reach that place at the top of the pinnacle, which there's no other place like that on earth, we've proven that that is Heliopolis, where, as we've shown, they did build a Jerusalem. In the book of Josephus's Book of the Wars and stuff, he talks about the Jerusalem that was there in Heliopolis, rebuilt by a man named On, or the Temple of On, or John. And he had a heir to his position whose name was, sometimes they translate Jason, but it's Jesus, because you could say Usus or Isun, which is translated Jason. But we're going to find out about this pyramid, about this science, about these symbols. We're going to show you the meanings of all of these words, like Peter and Cephas, and where this came from in the Egyptian pantheon, and the word Ta, which has to do with Peter, the word Api, or Apepi, or Apophis, which, you might remember that NASA shot a missile and named it Apophis or something. But these words have to do with, well, they're different renditions as it's come down to us in different languages for the same apex, which is also why they named the monkey the ape or the api, which is the center, or in Greek, Cepheus, or Peter. Yeah, with a P. So all of this is connected. We're going to show you that Cephas is indeed a reference to the Father. Otherwise, in a more ancient Attic Greek is Cepheus, which is where they got their legends. The Greeks took their legends from Athens. And we'll get into this, and I guarantee tomorrow's lesson will be even better than today's. But we're over an hour, so I'm going to leave it there. We haven't got time today. We'll talk to you tomorrow about all of this amazing, beautiful things. So I hope you have a wonderful evening, friends. I've got a lot to do today. I want to try and get this uploaded. I got to go to town. And today I'm going to get some, hopefully try to get my wisteria if they have it in town, but I don't think they do. But I do have to go into town to get a few supplies. So I'm going to let you go. I love you guys. The Lord will bless you. His grace and His peace will be with you, and we will see you tomorrow. Have a good one.